Look up the relationship between professionalism and white supremacy. I did when I did my second paper of my dissertation on white supremacy culture. This framework is from the 90s, but I didn't become familiar with it until 2020. It was in a very tough work environment where, even though I had begun my dissertation on the unwritten rules of work, I had started working in a place a lot of the employees were talking about how white the culture was and how problematic, and I didn't understand what they were referring to. And even at that point in my life, I had come to understand systemic institutional racism like as a concept, but I was struggling to still see it as a norm. And I'm sure I still do. So I took myself to some trainings outside of work. There was this really great nonprofit that had a free training on this, on white supremacy culture, and I thought it was awesome. And I kept looking into it, and I couldn't find much empirical work that had been done on it. It was based on people's lived experience. So it seemed to me, which is 100% valid. I was just wondering if, while I was going ahead and looking at work norms, if I could find some data on it. Most common one we saw was the idea that there's only one right way to do things. This is when organizations only value one way to do things, one way to look, one way to act, one way to interact with people. It's the belief that there's one correct way, and those who don't adhere to it are wrong. And this is the idea behind a lot of my unwritten rules too. I totally believe that the unwritten rules are entrenched in white supremacy, as most cultural things in post-colonized countries are. The second most common was the fallacy of objectivity, which is the idea that it is possible to have an objective, unbiased opinion, that emotions are destructive and irrational, and claiming to remove the emotion from decisions and the bias. None of us can do that. We all have our own perspectives and own interests. You see this a lot in people thinking they're being logical. Specifically with race, you see this with people being like, well, it's not logical that racism would exist, right? Or that would be due to race. Yeah, it's not logical to enslave people from one side of a continent either, but here we are. Like, it happened. It doesn't mean it's logical. Other ones we saw that were very common were individualism, power hoarding, perfectionism, either or thinking, and the right to comfort. Ones we saw like a moderate amount were quantity over quality, paternalism, and sense of urgency. The only ones we didn't see much of was worship of the written word and defensiveness. Now, just because we didn't see a lot of them doesn't mean they don't exist. This was a qualitative study, which we don't normally put percentages behind. It's not generalizable. This was to get the ball rolling because there's not, at least at this time, there wasn't like a white supremacy culture scale that we could administer and test for statistical differences. So we wanted to, based on the interviews I was already doing on unwritten rules of work, see if we noticed these patterns, which arguably that data could be used to build a scale, which is what I have done with the other data on the unwritten rules of work for the working class. But we put these in percentages because we were looking for prevalence, and we were also looking at if there were differences between race and gender groups. But again, we can't statistically test that. We were just interested in the themes because we're nerds. Now, the inter-rater reliability on this when we were coding this was low because we really struggled, even though we had a very diverse team. We struggled with, and maybe because we had a very diverse team, we struggled with how interconnected a lot of these things are. So it wasn't that someone wasn't seeing these patterns showing up, it would be that we would call them different things. So, for example, remember struggling to code is something objectivity or is it the right to comfort? Because the quote would be like removing emotion from something. It would be like, are they removing it because they think it makes them uncomfortable? Or are they removing it because they think it makes them more objective? And paternalism versus power hoarding, that one we also had a hard time distinguishing between, because paternalism is making decisions for other people without their input, and then power hoarding is keeping people intentionally out of power. And those rely on each other. When you power hoard, you can practice paternalism. So it was tricky to put thematic analysis behind it. The way I got from it was how much cultural norms rely on each other, how prevalent they are in our workspaces. Ironic these things can be, because like there's like the focus on perfectionism, which isn't not doing your best. It's doing things like nothing is good enough, and the bar of excellence is different for certain people. You can see this in academia explicitly. Like for tenure, for people to get nominated for tenure, there isn't a criteria people have to meet. It's literally a vote of if your peers like you. So there's not a certain amount of studies you have to publish. There's not a certain amount of teaching you have to do or ratings that you get from your students or et cetera. No, it's just people like you. So there's a lot of room for bias because you can never be good enough if you don't already fit in. Versus contrast that with a sense of urgency, which is just hurry up and get things done. And we don't have time for quality, and we don't have time for if people are getting hurt or the planet's getting hurt or whatever. So yeah, I 100% agree. I have found this to be important to research, but difficult to parse through, which is part of why my unwritten rules are very specific, and even those are interrelated. I'm interested in looking at how different systems interlock, such as classism, racism, sexism, etc., because that is what enforces all of these systems to not go away very easily.